China has become the world's largest auto market as its electric vehicle industry takes center stage. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. According to an International Energy Agency report, China's booming EV industry now accounts for nearly 60% of sales worldwide, with Chinese car manufacturer BYD surpassing Tesla as the #1 seller of electric vehicles. The country has also developed advanced technology using old batteries, a key part of its efforts to promote clean and sustainable energy. CGTN's Tang Bo has this report.
Another ordinary charging process. But this time, what's feeding the electric vehicle are some used batteries. Behind the scenes, a recycling system is making decommissioned batteries work again.
This system is composed of 122,000 battery cells that were scrapped and disassembled from 80 buses and 76 cars. The remaining capacity of the battery cells is about 80% and can continue to work for about 5 to 6 years. This system brings together approximately 12 million kilowatt-hours capacity of retired batteries.
The recycling system is operated by Baoqing Energy Storage Station in Shenzhen in southern China's Guangdong province. Since the system began operating in 2021, the cumulative power generation has reached over 1.7 million kilowatt-hours, equivalent to the daily electricity consumption of nearly 300,000 people. It's expected that by 2025, China will have retired a total of about 780,000 tons of auto batteries. Reusing them for power generation is just one option to handle them. Chen Man, a professor-level senior engineer from China's Southern Power Grid, sees other great opportunities from decommissioned batteries.
Generally speaking, electric vehicle batteries can be retired when they only retain 80% of their capacity, but they can still be repurposed for less energy-intensive roles, such as in energy storage facilities. Besides, batteries are rich in lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Recovering these valuable materials can help reduce our reliance on foreign key raw materials.
This month, the European Union implemented a new regulation requiring 70% of all batteries to be recycled by the end of 2030. This increases demands on China's battery makers and recyclers, as the EU is a major importer of lithium batteries from China.
The new European battery regulation makes demands in keeping records of manufacturing history and chemical components. That will push battery manufacturers and recyclers in China to make changes proactively.
Experts believe that the only way for industries to adapt to new international standards is by achieving an integrated layout from battery production all the way to robust recycling practices. Strengthening the collection and monitoring of the used batteries, reducing carbon emissions through production, and establishing new business models that integrate green tech are the ways in which the goals can be realized. Tang Bo, CGTN, Shenzhen, Guangdong Province.
To discuss the EV industry and where it's heading, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Dubai, Salman Hussain is the co-founder and CEO of Fuse AE. From Tennessee, Tyson Jominy is the Vice President of Data Analytics and Consulting at JD Power. From London, we're joined by Andy Mock. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And in Massachusetts, Xing is the co-host of China EVs and More. Welcome to all of you. Xing, let me start with you. And as I said, China is now the #1 seller of electric vehicles. It's also the #1 manufacturer. But the focus is now switching to something called new energy vehicles, NEVs for short. And sales of those types of vehicles are expected to reach something like 11.5 million in 2024. What can you tell us about these vehicles and how it's changing the EV industry?
Thank you for having me. First of all, China is the world's largest auto and NEV market and will continue to be the world's largest auto and NEV market for years to come. But having said that, this year we're seeing the tide recede a little bit, and you're seeing some of the boats capsizing. I think that's number one. And then we're continuing to see this price war, prolonged price war. And starting off in the year of the dragon, it's becoming a bloodbath. And that's partially due to the kind of the competitive environment, economic environment. And also, these companies are now trying to go global. And in order to sustain the capacity, given the current market environment in China, there's this drive to go global. But at the same time, I think you're going to see consolidation finally happening.
Xing, when you say the tide is receding, boats are capsizing, I mean, what's the reason behind that? I would imagine that if there's more price competition, demand would go up.
Well, there's several reasons. There's, for some of these companies, lack of capital, scale, cost advantage is currently key factors for the battle for survival. And if you don't have that, unfortunately, I think you're going to be driven out purely because you're under pressure to price these vehicles competitively. And one example is BYD, the number one NEV manufacturer in sales. They are cutting prices, and they have that advantage, cost advantage, whereas others don't. And they're the number one. They already have, the 3 million units a year manufacturer, and they're cutting prices. So imagine these smaller players that can afford to sustain that activity or tactic.
Tyson, we're also seeing pressure on the EV industry right here in the United States. In fact, there was a report released by the Reuters news agency on Thursday in which it quotes several industry leaders as saying that there is a slowdown in demand. Both Ford and GM are now cutting targets, and even Elon Musk, the chief at Tesla, is warning of a, quote, sharp slowdown in sales growth. What's behind that here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors that are actually driving that, but we would be remiss not to take into account interest rate movements. We're seeing that interest rates, particularly back in Q4 of last year, on all loans in the auto industry, went up very sharply in October, but in particular on EVs, where the amount financed is about 50% higher than what we see on the gasoline side. So the effect of interest rates is really compounding on EV loans, which is helping to pull down demand. But as we've seen, there's a lot of price cuts in China, there's a lot in Western Europe, and there are a lot of price cuts going on in the US. I mean, this week alone, we're seeing some massive price cuts from Ford Motor Company on their F-150 Lightning pickup, as well as their Mustang Mach-E SUV. So we're seeing a lot of price movement down here to stimulate that demand because, as you said, EV sales are starting to slow down.
And Tyson, to what extent does inadequate or insufficient infrastructure, EV infrastructure, contribute to lower sales growth? Things like the build-out of charging plants around the country.
It's certainly a factor. I mean, in the U.S., J.D. Power data show that well over 80% of all charging is done at home. And so if you don't have off-street parking or a garage or the ability to charge your vehicle at work, you are reliant on this public infrastructure to charge your vehicle. So for most of those consumers that don't have that luxury of charging at home, they're not in the EV market in the U.S. as of now because it's such a challenge to get your vehicle charged properly. The U.S. EV charging infrastructure is severely lagging.
Salman Hussain, you're in Dubai, and the Middle East is becoming a major market for Chinese EVs. In fact, the Chinese car manufacturer BYD is looking to expand in the region. What can you tell us about the market there in the Gulf, as well as in the wider Middle East?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of brands from China now moving both to the Middle Eastern markets and to Europe. I mean, I was recently at the Zeekr showroom in Amsterdam, and I'm seeing that Zeekr launched last week in Saudi Arabia, and they intend to do the same here. So you have a lot of big family companies here in the Middle East, in KSA and in the UAE, signing agreements with big players like BYD, with Zeekr, and a lot of other brands coming in. So we're seeing a lot of movement happening. And with the KSA and the UAE being some of the most developed and ready for electric vehicles in terms of charging stations, I think that the new wave of Chinese EVs that are coming here, it's only going to make the market much more competitive. Historically, Tesla has had that advantage here, but we're seeing that the price cuts that the Chinese OEMs are bringing in are drastically shifting that market.
Andy, Mark, we are seeing pushback from Europe concerning Chinese EVs. In fact, European investigators are looking at imposing tariffs on imports of Chinese EVs. That probe started in October of 2023 and is expected to last something like 13 months. I mean, what do you know about these investigations and what's exactly behind them? And is this an effort at protecting, what, the European EV industry?
Sure. Well, Nan, we have to recognize that, first of all, the traditional automotive industry, the internal combustion engine automotive industry, is a pillar of the European economy, especially in places like Germany. So this really poses a challenge, and I would say almost even an existential dilemma for Europe, because clearly no one disputes that because of Chinese government policy, the vigor of its companies like BYD and other companies, CATL, the battery manufacturer, and its manufacturing capability, that China is, without dispute, the technological leader as well as the market leader in this space. So for the Europeans, of course, like any region, any country, they want to protect their own domestic industries, but at the same time, they are acutely aware of the importance of taking proactive measures on climate change. And EVs are a vital piece of that puzzle, in particular, as we see now in this earlier piece about the life cycle management of batteries. So this was one of the big question marks from an environmental perspective. What do you do with these batteries? And we see here, yet again, China's ability to think in an integrative, holistic way to come up with a solution and not only conceptualize the solution, but actually implement it at scale. So I think this presents a very painful dilemma for the Europeans.
There seems to be a bit of a positive outlook, Andy, from BYD, the Chinese manufacturer. BYD has just announced that it will be expanding in Europe. In fact, it's going to be building a major plant in Hungary. This will be an automated plant using robotics. I mean, is this indicative, as far as BYD is concerned, that they expect that market to expand pretty considerably?
Absolutely, Anand. And I think that this also shows that Chinese manufacturers are looking to adapt, work with, and address not only technical challenges, consumer-facing marketing challenges, but geopolitical and national-level economic challenges as well. And of course, one way you can do that is you can invest in Europe. You can create jobs. You can do other things that promote economic prosperity there that can ease the transition. So clearly, again, this is a hard choice for Europe, and I think companies like BYD recognize that they can help the world move to a more sustainable future from a climate and environmental protection perspective.
Salman, you wanted to say something? Go ahead.
A lot of these companies that are coming in here, there's a lot of innovation happening. So when you look at the likes of BYD, certainly they have the scale. But then you have companies like NIO that are doing battery swapping. And it's something that they brought into Norway, and they're planning to bring that into the Middle East as well. This really radically changes the question of charging infrastructure, because you can have a battery swap in a matter of minutes. And over the course of putting them down on highways, you're effectively able to solve for the battery issue. And so innovations like that are coming out are really helping and giving those companies like NIO a cutting edge.
Xing, Chinese EVs are also taking a foothold in countries in Latin America. And if we look at Mexico, Brazil, Cuba, Colombia, they're making inroads in those countries. What's driving sales there? And of course, there is also that other question which comes up very often. What about infrastructure, charging infrastructure in these countries?
Well, I think someone just mentioned technological leadership, and that's one reason. And the other reason is what I call the several T's. So the availability, quality, agility, and quantity of all these Chinese EV companies led by BYD. And they're filling a void in several of these, not only in the Americas regions, but other parts of the world, where they have these tech-rich, quality, affordable products and meeting the demand in different regions of the market. And BYD is building a plant in South America. And BYD, I would always say that they're all over America except America. And you know that they'll. I think the Chinese, it's natural for them to go global as any other automotive brand, and you know they'll do this given the current requirements and whatever policies are in place. They will try to meet those requirements and try to compete. I think that's at the end of the day, that's like anybody else.
Tyson, Tesla chief Elon Musk, he said this about the EV industry in January, and I'm quoting him here directly. He said, "The Chinese car companies are the most competitive car companies in the world, so I think they will have significant success outside of China, depending on what kind of tariffs or trade barriers are established. Frankly, I think if there are no trade barriers established, they will pretty much demolish most other companies in the world." I mean, what do you make of a statement like that? It does smack of protectionism, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the car industry, like several other critical industries to a country, countries will go to great extent to protect their native car industry. I mean, like a national beer, a national car company is one of the defining milestones of a culture. So countries will get very aggressive to protect it. But Mr. Musk is certainly correct that without barriers, there could be a lot of entry, certainly in the U.S. market. The sub $30,000 price point has been all but left behind by automakers. Prior to COVID, sub 30,000 was 50% of sales in the U.S. Now it's 17% of sales in the U.S. So if there's a cheap entry on a price point that could come in offering the features that consumers want, that market is there for the taking. Now, there are protectionist laws in place and regulations that would probably prevent that. But that's why I find BYD's Mexico facility so interesting, because that does give the platform for an automaker like BYD to take a much closer look at the United States.
And there is another challenge in the United States, Tyson, and it's something that's very difficult to quantify, but I know it's there because we've heard this from people on previous shows that we've done on EVs, and that is there is a cultural resistance in the United States to electric vehicles. I mean, so much of modern American culture is about gas-driven cars.
Yeah, I mean, EVs in the U.S., right or wrong, are greatly affiliated with a political party. So often one's political stance will take some away from what kind of vehicle they would buy. In particular, EVs are associated with President Biden and the Democratic Party. So those of Republican or right-wing leaning persuasion seem to have a resistance to EVs that maybe we don't see in some other countries. So it is a very cultural item, and that will for a while put a limit on how high EVs can go in the U.S. If a third of consumers won't consider them for reasons other than transportation-driven reasons here, we're going to find that the market will always be capped for what EVs can do, short of regulation changes.
Andy, Mark, talking about how politics gets in the way of EV development, President Biden, of course, signed the Inflation Reduction Act. He signed that into law. It doesn't allow Chinese companies to benefit from American oil subsidies. There's also a 25% tariff on Chinese-made cars on top of the regular 2.5% on imported cars. I mean, some, as I said, are referring to this as protectionist measures. But how is politics playing into this?
Well, Anand, politics clearly is playing a central role here, both in an international sense through tariffs, other barriers, and in a domestic sense, as we just heard as well, in that rightly or wrongly, a significant number of Americans have a political view on electric vehicles. And I'd like to hear maybe zoom out a bit and offer a little bit of context on, I think, what's going on in the future, including some of the political considerations with electric vehicles, in that what makes this possible is energy storage, so breakthroughs in batteries, which China is leading, but also on the horizon are rapid advances in artificial intelligence and robotics. So what this means is, in addition to a world that electric vehicles are ubiquitous, they also may be autonomous as well. So we can think of them as autonomous taxi fleets versus owning a car. And this has implications for charging infrastructure. So this means that you might not need a charging station in every home, because you might just pay as you go. Mobility as a service, some might call it.
No, Andy, what I was going to ask you about was autonomous vehicles, and that is, we're still a pretty long way from there, aren't we?
Well, yes and no. So I think one of the big challenges is more regulatory versus technological. There also is enormous public opinion sensitivity to this. But if I may finish it on about the political aspect of this, where we may end up is the U.S. will be an isolated island that may be left behind in this transition to a new energy future, of which mobility is a vital part, precisely because of these domestic political considerations, as well as its foreign policy stance.
Xing, what about the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in the development of new vehicles? I mean, we are hearing a lot about that. And when we hear, you know, AI, it creates a lot of excitement, but there's also a lot of anxiety about AI. We're also hearing about intelligent driving. What is that?
That's where a lot of stigmatization is coming, politics on China, because AI, and we heard about, you know, NVIDIA, great performance last quarter, but a lot of it is, a part of it is in the Chinese market, specifically for the training, autonomous vehicle training. They use a lot of, depending on a lot of NVIDIA chips, and we're seeing that political headwinds play out, and chip is only one part of that, right? There's the battery cells, there's the critical materials, but I think within China there's this homegrown the ability to grow, and in certain technology area, including AI, despite the restrictions. I think you're going to see that played out as well. You know, it's a fine balance, I think, in a way.
Salman, you know, as we heard from our correspondent, China has started repurposing automotive batteries, extending effectively the life of these batteries. Your company, Fuse AE, is doing something similar, which is transforming gas vehicles into clean EVs. What can you tell us about that?
I mean, this is a growing trend now that we're seeing a lot in the mobility space. And actually, a lot of companies in China are also catering to this growing market of not just your passenger vehicles, but mainly your commercial fleets, especially those that have a high capex cost that you can retrofit for a much lower cost than having to buy brand new. And so doing that, a company like ours can offer a savings of between 40 and 60% over buying a new vehicle. And that's something that I think for the transition that we need to make, keeping in mind that now we're hitting, in a lot of markets, the mass adoption stage. These kind of price points is what we will need to be able to switch those very polluting sectors like transport into EV. And so we're going to see light commercial fleets like 1 to 3 tons, and then later a little bit higher in the 3 to 5 ton category as well, switch over to electric. There are new offerings. Retrofit offers a great way for markets that might be underdeveloped or emerging markets to be able to make that switch without necessarily having to pay that high capex.
Tyson, we were talking a moment ago about autonomous vehicles. There has been some progress in the United States, hasn't there? I mean, there are places like San Francisco, for instance. They've been using autonomous taxis for quite some time right now. Do you see that expanding?
Well, it's sort of been one step forward, one step back recently. I mean, you can get them in San Francisco, Las Vegas, and some other cities, but there have been some very notable incidents recently with autonomous vehicles colliding with pedestrians very publicly, creating backlash to it. So AVs will continue to develop and advance. I think it's going to be at a slower pace, though. Perhaps I'm more of a pessimist than some others here on the panel. I think it's going to take a lot longer to get there. But within a geofence area, I think we'll see a significant growth in that market.
Andy, there's one other concern, and that is, as this technology evolves, there are concerns about cybersecurity and, how governments regulate the use of this kind of advanced technology. How big a challenge is that?
Well, I think it certainly is a significant concern, Anand, and it's only going to become more so as more and more individuals, businesses, even governments adopt EVs for their fleets. So there's two aspects to this. So the first, of course, is the information. So you may not want hostile actors to know the whereabouts of large groups of people or certain groups of people. So that's one. The second is the concern, of course, is what happens if a vehicle is hacked and someone takes control of it. So clearly, I think this is a very, very important question that we will, I'm sure, be talking about more in the future, but it's broader than just electric vehicles, because as we see the convergence of the real world and the digital world through robotics, as we rely more and more on artificial intelligence to manage our lives, that this is only going to become a bigger issue.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.